Hello and welcome to this ETOA webinar on interpreting tourism data. My name is Rachel Reed. I'm Director of Insight here at ETOA, and I'm delighted to be joined today by David Edwards, our resident tourism stats expert, Jennifer Edu, Head of Research and Development at the European Travel Commission, and Tom Jenkins, our CEO, who is a familiar figure for many of you, I'm sure. So a very warm welcome to all three of you today. We are going to be stepping into the minefield that is tourism data, looking at things to be aware of when using industry stats as a business tool. David has recently written a paper on this, which is available on our Insight Hub, etoa.org/insight, or you can navigate to it directly from our homepage, and you can download the full report from there should you wish to. If you haven't visited the Insight Hub before, you will find a wealth of tourism stats reports from all over the industry, lots of different sources, all categorized by things like destinations, origin markets, value of tourism, etc. And for most of them, David has written a useful summary. So if you don't have time to read the whole report, you can just read his summaries or click through for the full report should you wish. So have a look at the Insight Hub, either to download David's report for today or any of our other pieces that are there. We'll be using David's paper as the starting point for our discussions today. So I will hand over to you, David, to kick things off.
Thank you very much indeed, Rachel. So for the next 10 to 15 minutes, I will be talking about interpreting the stats and navigating the pitfalls. We will begin very shortly. No open questions, which is not what I want to see. Oh, here we go. We will start by talking about aggregation of arrivals data. Now, we might imagine that the number of people who are counted going outbound in the world is the same as the number of people going inbound to destinations around the world. If only life was so simple. Now, outbound departure data from a source market will often, in fact, not tally with inbound arrivals data at a destination. For example, US Department of Commerce data for 2019 indicates that there were 17.3 million visits by Americans to Europe. Of course, the first issue is that Europe might mean different things to different people, but we'll skip over that issue. But each country in Europe will count arriving US visitors, and on average, each US visitor to Europe visits 1.5 countries during their trip. So the point holds true also for subnational arrivals data, as visitors may spend nights in different regions of the same country. So, for example, were you to add up the number of visitors to Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England, you would in fact get to a number rather higher than is the tally for inbound visits to the whole of the United Kingdom. So, the rule here is that adding up may not always give you the correct total. Now let's talk about simplification of trip purpose. We're always interested in why international travelers are traveling. Now, different destinations can use different classification systems, and some types of trips may be excluded by one destination, but included by another. A minority of trips really will be across multiple purposes, for example, holiday and business, VFR and holiday. However, if we are relying on visitors being surveyed to allocate them to a particular trip purpose, we won't necessarily know if somebody is on one of these multi-purpose trips, quite how they will have defined it. And there's always the catch-all other category. Now, that will vary from one country to another, and very often it will aggregate different market segments. For example, it might include study, medical treatment, au pairs. Now, within the tourism sector, we often think of business tourism as simply being those who are traveling for what we might term the MICE segment, whereas in reality, they could well include people traveling for everyday business activities. And indeed, many destinations count international business visitors who are simply international truck drivers. And leisure, of course, can mean different things to different people. Sometimes it will include visits to friends and relatives, and sometimes, from some destinations, it won't. Now, we're really interested in how much we earn as international destinations from visitors, so we need to focus on visitor spend data. And time series data expressed in what are termed outturn prices will portray a different trend to the same data expressed in constant prices. Now, this is all about whether or not we have adjusted the time series for inflation. At times of relatively low inflation, that might not make a huge difference, but clearly we live in a time of relatively high inflation, so it does. Here's an illustration. In outturn prices, inbound spending to the UK increased by 861% between 1980 and 2019. However, were we to adjust that time series for inflation, we would find that in constant prices, it increased by a mere 122%. So a rather different conclusion. And of course, that means we have to adjust for inflation in different countries if we want to look at how countries are performing against one another. And comparing spending across different countries poses yet another challenge, and this is the challenge of exchange rate variations, both within a single year and of course across years. So back in March of 2008, an American coming to the UK saying, I spent $1,000. Well, they would have in fact spent £500 in sterling. Whereas today, and this was at 8 a.m. today, so who knows what it is now, they would have spent £906 in sterling, but still just spent $1,000 in their own mind. Ooh. Rachel, I'm now seeing a picture of you, which I wasn't expecting. There we go. Sampling methodologies. Now, very many of our data is reliant upon surveys.
David, I do apologise to interrupt. Could you reshare your screen? I don't think we can see your slides.
Ooh. Share screen. Hopefully you are again now seeing a slide called sampling methodologies.
We are, thank you.
Marvelous. Do apologize for the gremlins that seem to be affecting us. As I was saying, much of our data is reliant upon surveys, and they are wonderful, but they are also full of rabbit holes which we might fall down. Now, any survey is subject to sampling error, but more often than not, confidence intervals are not presented alongside estimates that are based on a survey. And what we mean by confidence intervals is the range within which the estimate truly sits, because we have not asked everybody in the population, therefore we only have a sample view, and we have what's called a margin of error. But very rarely will you see these margins of errors presented alongside survey estimates. But there are other errors that exist too, including coverage error, whereby findings will not be fully representative of a population. For example, if we're interested in interviewing guests in a hotel and we only interview guests who stay between Mondays and Fridays and not those who stay on Saturdays and Sundays, we might not get the true picture. Then there's something called measurement error, and this can arise due to poorly worded questions, and that can either be by accident or on occasions it can be by design that questions are worded in a particular way, or indeed it can be due to poor interviewing techniques. Then finally, there is something called non-response error or bias, and this arises when some people, some groups, may be more likely than others to say, no, thank you, I don't want to take your survey. For example, perhaps in an airport environment, those who are running very late for their flight might be less inclined than those who are arriving with many hours to spare. So always question survey design and execution don't just ask what's a sample size, because sometimes a relatively small sample size can be equally powerful if it's a well-designed survey as a large sample size on a poorly designed survey. Now let's talk about units of measurement. Now, some destinations report the number of overnight visits, while others report the number of arrivals, including day trip visits. If we cast our minds back to pre-pandemic days, if you were to look at arrivals figures for the likes of Singapore or Hong Kong, they were dramatically different to the number of overnight visitors because of the number of cross-border trips that happened on a daily basis. So it's really important to understand what it is that you are looking at when you're viewing visits or visitor nights data. Now, trends in visits to different destinations may be different to trends in visitor nights, and this can arise if there is a variance in the length of stay trends. So if one destination is seeing a growing average length of stay, whereas another is seeing a declining length of stay, you're going to have an issue. There's also the issue of how do you calculate average length of stay? Here again, you need to be really careful to ensure that overnight visits are being looked at and that day trips are being excluded, because day trippers clearly don't spend any nights at all in the destination. Now let's think about some data from the hotel sector. Room occupancy is very different to bed space occupancy, by which we mean that the typical hotel room will be able to accommodate more than one person. And it is important to ensure that account is taken of which rooms, or indeed bed spaces, were available for sale during the reference period. So we don't just say, right, how many people stayed in that hotel and divide it by the number of rooms. We need to know what the number of available room nights were to ensure we're getting an accurate metric. Now, over time, occupancy rates at a destination may appear stable, but if supply is shrinking more quickly than demand, our interpretation of that data may be rather misguided. So whenever you're looking at data that's based on a quotient or fraction, it's really important to think about what are the trends for both the numerator and also for the denominator. So when to be wary? Well, always look to see if data tables or charts has a footnote. And if it does, what does it say? Because sometimes that can really be very informative information. Establish both the survey methodology as well as the sample size. Look to see whether or not confidence intervals are mentioned. They probably won't be, but it will be great if they are. Think about who is conducting the survey and what message they might be wishing to convey. So even if a survey has been well executed and well designed, it may be that the interpretation is somewhat skewed by the author of a particular report. Now, don't imagine that comparing data from one destination with that of another is as straightforward as we might like it to be. So benchmarking, we all love to do it, we all want to do it, but it can be fraught with difficulties. So the overarching message is, in short, always be inquisitive about the data. With that, again, apologies for the technical glitches early on. I will hand back to Rachel and stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Gosh, plenty of food for thought there, and areas where we could fall down. So I will now like to invite Jennifer and Tom to join the discussion. And just before I do, feel free, please, to send any questions for our panelists via the chat. If you type them into the chat, I can put them to the panelists as we go through our discussion. So Jennifer, coming to you, ETC obviously undertakes a lot of primary research, and you have to grapple with these discrepancies on a regular basis in your life. So I'd like now to invite your perspective on maybe the things you've seen and some of the best ways that we can handle this stuff. So Jennifer.
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for having me. At ETC, we collect tourism statistics mainly to report on tourism trends and prospects, tourism products and segments, And in pretty much all cases, we use mixed methods. So quantitative research methodologies combined with qualitative ones as a supporting way to do things. And we actually deal with all the issues that have been mentioned by David. When looking at tourist arrivals, for example, measuring tourism flows, we have destinations that might report only on tourism arrivals, at frontiers, or overnight, or both. And actually, these two metrics can still be measured differently by a destination. We also have destinations that, well, not all of them report data for the specific time period that we are looking at. Figures are constantly being reviewed and updated. So how do you display all of this in one single map? We always try to be as transparent as possible, add in as many footnotes as are necessary to help people better interpret the data. For instance, as well, if you're purchasing accommodation statistics, it's very important that you look at the methodological approach. And why? Because you could be actually reporting on a very small proportion of the tourism accommodation at a given destination. You need to make sure that the data that you're looking at includes other forms of paid accommodation like campsites or hostels, motels. And what about those forms of paid accommodation that do not require a registration? So people that are staying with friends and relatives. You also have travelers that are staying in more than one accommodation establishment within one same destination. So hopefully, well, thankfully, we do have common standards that are always very helpful to have data that is comparable. During David's presentation, we also talked about online questionnaires. And when we do online questionnaires and we work with panels, we always ask ourselves, are we reaching the right audience? We know that people taking part of an online questionnaire, they need to own a computer, they need to be computer literate. So we might be leaving behind a bunch of people that have the potential to be part of our survey. Other issues that we also struggle with, you can have respondents that are only driven by getting a reward in exchange of taking part of the survey. Also survey fatigue, people that are just answering to the same questions all the time or taking the survey very quickly just to get over with it as soon as possible and actually giving unreliable results. Luckily, there are many techniques to test the quality of panel responses as well. You could add cross-checking questions. You could also check the time that a respondent takes to complete the survey questionnaire. If it takes 20 minutes and they took 5 minutes, then perhaps you could not rely on that response. You could also see whether they provide the same answer all the time. And then you know that this response or questionnaire needs to be rejected. There are also other techniques that we could put in place to see whether we have good results, whether they are reliable, and also to test the accuracy of our surveys. They can also be tested. And just to finalize, David also talked about tourism spend. This is actually one of my favorite topics because from my personal standpoint, considering the macroeconomic environment is as fundamental as using multiple sources. You could check not only credit card data, but you can also check national banks. And let's say, for instance, that you're working with credit card data, you need to be ask yourself several questions. What is the share of people using this specific credit card? Is it only considering in-destination purchases or also online purchases? Is it also, well, how is inflation or let's say a macroeconomic aspect being considered or being computed within the data? And another very important question to ask ourselves is whether we are considering cross-border shopping or transit visitors. So all these are aspects that may need to be taken into account when looking at tourism spend. And we've also seen that many of our members are struggling to get well, we have very few that have robust and solid data on tourism spend. So as David pointed out, we need to be very inquisitive and look at the footnotes and of course advocate for transparency when communicating tourism statistics.
Absolutely. The more transparency, the better. Tom, I wondered if you wanted to make any comments on the things that David and Jennifer have raised.
I do. I think, thank you both, David and Jennifer. I think this was extraordinarily interesting. And Jennifer, you rightly pointed out the complications that confront anybody trying to produce aggregate data. And you in particular have to do on assembling information across national boundaries, and this is not easy at all. I mean, it's really difficult. I'm intrigued. I suppose I've got two questions, maybe for David, and neither of them are going to be easy to answer, so I'll throw them as screwballs. The first one is that it has always struck me that tourism statistics are prisoners of previous patterns of behavior. It's very interesting if you look at the ETC data, which is in some ways reliant on the UN WTO data, where you, for instance, show the number of Americans come to Europe. You do so by showing the number of Americans who have visited the individual countries in Europe, aggregated together. So for 2019, I think the figure is roughly 30 million visitors coming from America coming to Europe. Now, that, as David has pointed out, is not 30 million Americans coming to Europe. It's 30 million visits conducted by Americans to individual countries in Europe, which is a slightly different statistic. But anyone viewing it would just assume, well, that's 30 million people, and it isn't, because as David pointed out, that that 30 million figure is just the individual arrivals in each country. And that's just one example. I was just wondering, David, if you can think of other areas where we tend to just carry on publishing data because that's how we've always published it, even if it is in some ways misleading.
I think it is the good old supertanker argument that it is very slow to change the way in which statistics are gathered, reported, talked about. And once a system is in place within a country, because these things are not straightforward to do, they're very often not particularly cheap to do. Once that system is in place, it becomes very difficult to make change to that. You will have different groups arguing for different types of change potentially, or some entities lobbying that you should be using this particular type of data or that other particular type of data. And again, they might have some particular motive for putting forward that argument. And one of the things many years ago I used to say about the dear old International Passenger Survey, which is the mechanism used for capturing international visits and spend to the UK, was that it was consistently imperfect, which at least meant that you could look at trends over time. And yes, it wasn't the perfect survey, but if it was being done broadly in the same way year after year, at least you could have a great degree of faith in what the long-term trend was, rather than constantly changing the methodology, doing it differently, which may give you from one year to the next a more accurate piece of information. But many statisticians are more interested in the trend than the level, which I don't know whether that quite answers your question, but I think that it is the supertanker argument that it's jolly difficult to make changes. And if you do, you have to be sure that you're making those changes for the right reasons.
Thank you. David, sorry, Tom, I just wondered if I could perhaps put that to Jennifer, because obviously I know that there's a lot of work done on trends in ETC's reports. Do you think, Jennifer, that it's better, as David says, to sort of have consistently imperfect data so you have got trends to talk about, rather than not really being able to talk about trends because the methodologies keep moving?
I think when you add all these imperfections, then maybe you are adding a more complicated layer to the data and to the reliability. of the data that you have. So I personally would advocate for something that's always consistent, straightforward, having common standards, and making life easier in a world that is already complicated for everyone that's looking at your data.
Thanks. Tom, over to you.
No, you were right to throw it across. I suppose the other question is, it's almost an impossible question to answer, but I come from having dealt with people who've been on the receiving end of people misreading headlines. And the classic case is when a specific destination such as London, or it could be Paris, or it could be anywhere, which has come up with a statistic on tourism increases, which are based on a notional percentage of a sample survey which has been conducted at the airport, and they come up with a figure, say London's tourism has increased by 15%. And in reality, no one actually knows what the increase is in London, what the increase is in London, because no one has published the confidence limits on the survey. And it's perfectly possible, given the sample size, that the error may be as high as 10%, may even be higher. We just don't know what that ratio is. But a lot of people use this as benchmarking, and I don't know how we publicize that sample surveys should not be used as benchmarking for businesses to know whether they're beating the market or not. How do we stop this?
I guess one of the issues is it's not unreasonable that the businesses and governments and others are asking the question, how are we doing? What is the trend? And in a sense, therefore, we are reliant upon a survey because we cannot conduct a census. The crucial issue, as you rightly say, though, Tom, is that too rarely will there be it conveyed that this estimate sits within a range. Now, in the report that I've written for ETOA, I do talk about some of the confidence intervals for headline data, broken down by market, broken down by journey purpose, because it is there for inbound visits to the UK if you know where to look. But the ONS website can be a bit of a rabbit warren, and you might not know where to look, but the data is there. I can absolutely appreciate, though, why a journalist or a business wants a single number, not, oh, here's the estimate, here's the upper limit, here's the lower limit. That gives them three numbers. And unfortunately, we live in a world where attention spans are rather short, and people love knowing this is the answer. They don't want complication, unfortunately.
Well, do you think what they should do when they're publishing a graph, one of these famous trend graphs, which I like as much as, well, almost as much as you do, probably the right way of phrasing it. Do you think what they should do is, rather than publish a line, they should actually put a great big fuzzy blur to give you an indication of the parameters within which the real line might exist?
Indeed, that I think is a fine idea, and any connoisseurs of the Bank of England forecasts will be familiar with what are called those fan charts, which show the probability range, if you like, within which an estimate is likely to sit. So it is technically doable, but you would then have a rather thick line, if you like, on a chart, rather than a nice thin line. So there's no easy solution to this, but it's great that we're actually airing the fact that these survey estimates are just estimates within a range, rather than being the definitive answer.
So what you're saying is that they shouldn't draw it with a pencil, they should draw it with a wet sock, basically.
Your words, not mine.
That would be a more accurate depiction of the state of our ignorance. Okay.
Wet socks aside, though, Tom, I think one thing I would also say, certainly in my experience on this, is no matter how many footnotes and caveats appear on an original document, they tend to drop off as soon as they get forwarded or used elsewhere. So even if you do put all of this information on, my experience is that not just the media, just anybody sort of just drops that bit off, and it still doesn't get read beyond the first reading of the report. So I think unless you maybe stamp that on the front of the chart, like like they do for images with copyright, I don't know what the answer is to get people to read footnotes and caveats, really.
Oh, you should just make it compulsory. I think you should have it. They should say this as you have on investment websites and investments. Be aware this can go up and go down. There should be something really saying that this is a broad indication of which we're roughly confident, but don't bet your shirt on this one. I think would be the right attitude. And it gets. Am I right in thinking? I mean, Jennifer, is that we're dealing with two different sets of data. Really, we're dealing with counts. There are a number of. I'd be interested to hear from you actually which tourist offices in Europe do proper counts. I know, for example, the Greek tourist office has a count of the bed nights because there's a compulsory reporting of bed nights. So we know that's a reasonably secure piece of data. And there are other countries which are reliant wholly on passenger surveys. I just, do you know which ones? It sounds totally invidious to ask you in a way which ones are good and which ones are bad. So I'm not quite asking you that, but can you name those countries which have got reasonably secure counts of bed nights, for example?
I would be a bit cautious mentioning this in case I leave some of them behind, but I'm happy to send you this information by email. But what's important is to see where the data is coming from and how the metrics are measured, what they're considered. And for this, as Rachel pointed out, you need to look at the background information, at all the footnotes that people might be a bit lazy to look at in the end. But what's important is to make sure that the data that you're looking at is also coming from governmental statistics as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Sure enough. I've got a question. I suppose this is perhaps for Tom, possibly for Jennifer as well. I mean, Jennifer, you alluded to this when you were speaking about kind of standards and transparency. Why don't we have a standard framework that's used, across Europe? What is it that's stopping people? Is it just that it's an enormous piece of work? Is it that people fundamentally disagree on these things? And why haven't we got one?
For some things, we have common definitions, which are helpful. One of our members' best tasks to do is to benchmark themselves against each other. And so I suppose one of the difficulties in having a framework is that not all destinations can be compared. Some of them are larger than others. Some of them are bigger, have a bigger GDP. So not all destinations are comparable. That's why I think that's what makes it more difficult to have a common standards. We are working a lot on many initiatives to have more standard indicators, especially for sustainable tourism indicators. But we still see the struggle behind having something that is common and applicable to all destinations. Not all of them are equal in population, GDP. So there are many aspects that need to be considered, and we are perhaps a bit far from achieving something that is standardized, but that doesn't mean that there is not work behind on this. We are working on it, at least.
I think the longest and most ghastly process I've ever been involved in my position here is establishing a standard taxonomy for tourism definitions, which took place for the Institute for Normalization. And it was a horrific experience, but they came up with one that everyone disagrees with, but it's there. The idea of doing one on statistics, I think, might be it's beyond my pay grade at the moment. It's certainly patient's grade. It would be a really tough call, but it's a good question, Rachel. In some ways, it's a crying out need, and people want clarity. And I think this is the big danger: is that people want clarity, and therefore they seek clarity which doesn't exist in the numbers that they've got. And there's a kind of impulse on behalf of the consumer that everyone's very keen to meet, even if they can't do it. And this is one of the problems that we're wrestling with. The question I've got for David would, I mean, if people are out there, please pose questions in the chat and the question and answer. Otherwise, it's a four-way conversation, which is fine, but it's always good to have more involved in it. David, can you think of any? The thing many years ago, ETOA produced several reports on the Olympic Games, and I was very struck at the time at how possible it was for people who were, and we were broadly, I have to say, skeptical of the virtues of having an Olympic Games through a host destination. But I was very struck by the quantity of statistical information being marshaled by people who were very keen to promote the idea that the Olympic Games was a wonderful event to host for a destination. And I'm just wondering, have you got any examples other than the Olympic Games where you think statistics have actually genuinely been misleading?
I think whether we're talking about large events or small, there is a common thread running through, and that is that event organizers, sponsors, and destinations that bid to get those events are rather woolly when it comes to the fact that there is truly a ledger, so pluses and minuses in hosting an event, and they feel rather attached to the pluses and can sometimes be somewhat dismissive of the minuses. And it is very difficult within the sphere of tourism to really ascertain all of the relevant data that tells the true picture, because there will be benefits to a destination, but there will be losers too. And because there are, let's call them vested interests in saying, great, we've won this event, we're going to be hosting Eurovision in Liverpool, everything is going to be wonderful. Well, maybe, but maybe there's a wider picture to tell. And I think it's the challenge of getting those who are very committed to winning an event and wanting to argue that they have delivered a brilliant event to publicly recognize that there might be certain downsides as well, which doesn't mean to say that your ledger isn't on balance in favor of the positives, but there are two sides to that ledger rather than just one.
I wouldn't call them vested interests, David. I would call them three-piece suit wearing interests with an overcoat on top myself. But a vest is just a minor piece of underwear in comparison to the extent to which they're involved. I don't know whether you've got an opinion on this, Jennifer, whether there tends to be a misuse of data surrounding certain things.
Definitely, but I suppose I think it's also in the paper that David wrote, you need to make sure that, or check at least whether this is an official body that is sending this data or whether it's a private company, and perhaps would they be any benefits or anything they are expecting to when they're sharing specific data. Do they want to gain more clients, or, you know, this is essentially what one would actually need to look at, who is reporting this data. But I totally agree that in some instances, for beneficial purposes, some data is being misused, which is detrimental to other bodies that are sharing more reliable statistics.
I'm going to come to a couple of questions from our audience, a couple of interesting things coming in here. Somebody here asking, what do you think are the most exciting new data sources that we could explore that we aren't currently using? I don't know if anyone has a comment on that.
Ooh, I guess mobile phone data certainly has potential, so not in terms of knowing exactly who someone is, but it has the ability to certainly in a GPS, so mapping type sense, to understand how are people moving within a destination. So it can be really beneficial perhaps for visitor attractions or city centres to understand, right, where Where are the clogging up points? How long are people dwelling in particular places? You can monitor stuff in much more detail by using anonymized mobile phone data, recognizing that not everybody will have a mobile phone, and not everybody who does have one will have it on broadcast mode, if you like, but a significant proportion of visitors will. So that is certainly one of the pieces of data that is not necessarily great at telling you absolute statistics, but is perhaps helpful in understanding the way in which visitors geographically behave within an environment.
Just adding to that point as well, it can also be helpful in seeing, well, while you're looking at people's geolocation behavior, you can also see whether specific locations, cities, or attractions, if they're very much used, what the impact is to the, well, environmentally, whether there's a environmental part in the, well, essentially, when you're checking a small city, you can see whether many people go to this location, what the environmental impact is if you see that many people go to specific attractions or specific beach areas, and so on. That's basically the point.
Sorry, Rachel, I just to add to those two, I think the answer is there's loads of places we can go. I mean, anywhere that does a count is a potential data source. Famously, public transportation data is actually really useful, particularly if you're looking, if they can itemize when public transport services are being used by the population, usually for commuting, and when it's not, and they can measure surges in transportation use, which will give you a trend data for tourism use. This happens on London Transport, for example, and that's quite a big, powerful set of information that they've got at their disposal. The other thing there is, and it mirrors the mobile phone, and it's obviously comes heavily caveated because this is a niche sample, but I know Vox tours and other providers are available other than Vox, but Vox are very good at mapping usage of their systems, which are tourism information systems, and showing you exactly what the patterns of usage are in any city. So you can see how the people spread out, where the concentrations are, what the peak times are. It's quite a sophisticated articulation of visitor behavior. So there are lots of sources out there, and anybody with that information can provide it. And I think it's going to potentially be a very interesting area in future. Much more for micro information rather than macro flows. But if people are interested in what tourists do, how they spend money, where they do it, if we can come up with something which amalgamates spend and display how they occupy a geographic space, this becomes a very, very interesting and powerful tool. Sorry, over to you, Rachel. Other questions?
No, absolutely. No, this is actually an extension of that. Really, this is from Tommaso. Is about the use of artificial intelligence. And his question is it already being used, or does it have a potential role in projecting and analysing tourism data? Just do we know anything about AI in this area at all?
I think at the very early stages with AI, some other technologies that could definitely be helpful, especially coming from a post-pandemic era. You know that people want to, well, be in less crowded places and have maybe make queues and check into attractions with contactless applications. So this is one aspect where it could be very helpful coming from this couple of years that we are coming from.
So that's something for the future.
I know, David, you got anything to say on this?
No, I remain stonily silent. I would not claim that AI is something that I have any great expertise in.
I would just two things. One is, as we perhaps intimated, or I've probably made absolutely clear, interpreting tourism data, I think we welcome intelligence, let alone any artificial intelligence, only so far as it's so open to misinterpretation that it's shocking. And the area you have to tread incredibly carefully is on tourism predictions. This is an area which I've seen it go wrong so often. It's almost embarrassing that how wrong tourism predictions are. The only general prediction that you can make, and you don't need AI to tell you this, that in broad terms, that as prosperity goes up, tourism will go up, and we can anticipate more tourists in future, unless there are capacity constraints.
Absolutely.
Would you disagree with that statement, David?
I would agree that prosperity and just the size of the population and the extent to which travel is either easy or difficult. So in the 1980s, if you were rich and lived in France or Spain or Ireland or the UK, you couldn't really go to East Germany or Poland, even if you wanted to, whereas all of a sudden in the 1990s you could. So there's just practical barriers to how easy is it to travel, but absolutely, are people well enough off? So I often talk about my good old 3 M's. Do people have the motivation to travel? Do they have the means of transport to get to and from? And do they have the money to afford to get there and to have a nice time once they arrive?
Absolutely. There's one final question that has come in from Jonathan, and I believe it relates to hosting events, and when you were speaking, Tom, so I guess it's for you. His question was, what would be the downsides? I guess we mentioned that, and he just wanted a bit of clarity. Tom, I know obviously we've written very extensive papers on this, so when you answer, could you be mindful that we're almost at the end of the webinar?
I'll be careful. I think the thing to do is watch out for displacement, and also watch out for over expectation. The great disease of these things is that people think that the world is going to come, and the world tends not to come. The people who come are those people who are very specifically interested in that event. And it is an issue for the future, because we have an Olympic Games in Paris, which will undoubtedly showcase Paris beautifully to the world, but it will also cause massive displacement in one of the central destinations of European tourism. And we also have a coronation coming up next year, perhaps in June, which again will cause some displacement in London. Not dramatic, but for the week around the coronation, I imagine it's going to be fairly difficult for a tourist to get accommodation where they want to, or in the way that they usually would. David, is that a reasonable summary of the problem?
I think that's a reasonable summary. Yes, Tom.
Okay. He's not going to be drawn any further. This is why
I'm not going to be drawn any further.
Okay, Jennifer, is there anything you want to say about mega events and displacement?
Not about major events, but just mainly, well, encouraging everyone that works with data to take into consideration the fact that transparency is very important, and there's a very important ethical part when we share data and collect data from consumers. We need to see how the data is presented and make it as easier as possible and engaging as possible for people to check it and to understand and to interpret it as well, and make sure we're comparing apples to apples and not misleading the audience.
I have here, Tom, a comment from one of our listeners here, who says they worked for the IOC in Lausanne and fully agree with the observations that we have made. I would also say there's a question come in from him about extrapolation of data. I think this is probably the final one we'll be able to cover today. And he's saying he finds it amazing, I mean, especially considering the sample volume, coupled with the problem we've discussed about samples not necessarily being representative of the potential traveller group. And his question is, do we think that big data analysis would be useful to counter this? Because obviously if a sample size is quite small, it's difficult to make an extrapolation. Is there a way we could use big data to get a bigger sample, I suppose, and a more valid extrapolation?
I think it's always important to be mindful of a range of data sources, because in a sense, we are trying to construct a jigsaw and we will never have all of the pieces. One of the many challenges with big data, though, is you need to understand, well, what's going into this big data? What are we actually looking at? And do those who are interpreting it have sufficient expertise to be able to know what it is that they are looking at and what it is that is being told to them by that big data? So I'm always open to extra bits of data, but sometimes it's just really good to get proper feedback from proper people, and perhaps sometimes that can give you much deeper understanding than just trying to want to have lots and lots and lots of data. It's having good data rather than lots of data.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose the ideal is, can we have lots of good data?
Yes.
Tom, you look like you wanted to say something.
No, I was just wondering if there's anything you could say. I think the thing I would just plead with anyone looking at a presentation is just to say, what is this not telling me? I think this is always an open question. I mean, we and people who are not here today are forward keys, for example. They're a wonderfully powerful tool to see what future demand looks like, and it's this isn't a projection. This is actually a count of people booking air journeys, but it doesn't tell you what people are flying who are not using the proprietary software that they're drawing their information from. And there are airlines which aren't part of that. They're quite an important sector. And similarly, manifestly, it won't tell you what other tourists are doing. So when we were looking at the forward keys data showing you that the UK had suffered a 35% decline in business, which was only mirrored by Italy. Italy was also suffering a 35% decline in business. That was just from international flights arriving. It wasn't all the people who visit Italy by car from Germany and points north in Europe, where Italy had done really very well. So it wasn't, you have to look at such data and think, actually, this is interesting, but it's very, very limited in the scope of the insight it gives you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we have covered all the questions from our audience. I wonder if maybe I could come to you first, Tom, for any other closing remarks you may have on this topic.
Nothing. I think just we almost need to have a manifesto of what we would like to see on tourism data in terms of particularly confidence parameters on any data being published, which is reliant on sample size. I think this is the big ask that we have, because this is misinterpreted so frequently, so broadly. It really is quite distressing at times. But I'm just very grateful for this discussion, and maybe we should have an annual event where we pick out we should pick out areas where things are genuinely misleading and point out why it is. This might be quite entertaining for people who care about these things. That's all, Rachel. But I'd like to thank on your behalf Jennifer and David. I think this has been an excellent discussion. Thank you.
Wonderful. Jennifer, just to make sure we've covered everything from your side, is there anything you would like to add for our audience today?
I think I mentioned it just a few seconds ago, relying on multiple sources and advocating for transparency when we communicate data to the wider public.
Those are the things. David, what would you like to add to our manifesto?
I guess today we have sown lots of seeds of doubt, and we are right to do so, but we should not forget that in many ways we are very blessed within tourism. That we work in tourism, that is a blessing, but also that we do have an awfully wonderful range of statistics in interpretation and aggregate data and disaggregate data. So it is a wonderful thing to have all of these surveys and these numbers to explore. And yes, we need to be careful, we need to be inquisitive, as we've said throughout, but we should be grateful for the fact that we've got data to talk about and to critique, rather than being in a world with no data.
This is true. Absolutely. Well, with that, I'd like to thank Jennifer, David, and Tom, and all our listeners today, and wish you all a very good afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you, Richard. Bye.